Welcome to Bloodlore, where true history bleeds and the past never stays buried. Subscribe to uncover the dark chapters they don't teach. The morning Henry Cobb rode to the Whitlock farm, the frost still clung to every bare branch and fence post like a stubborn memory. The sun was weak, barely more than a pale smear in the sky, and the prairie was so quiet it seemed to hold its breath. Henry had waited longer than he should have. 2 missed Sundays at church had raised eyebrows, but it wasn't until the postmaster mentioned that no one had collected mail in weeks that Henry saddled his mare and made the long ride to the edge of Gray Hollow, where the Whitlock homestead stood, isolated among the windswept plains. He expected to find the brothers out working the field or holed up with the winter colds. The Whitlocks were known for keeping to themselves. Ezekiel, the eldest, was a stern man who rarely spoke unless necessary. Amos and Silas worked the land with a quiet determination, while the youngest, Jonah, often wandered off with books or strange rocks he'd dig up behind the barn. They were odd but not unfriendly. No one had ever known them to miss a service, though, especially not 4 in a row. When Henry crested the last hill and the house came into view, something in his gut turned cold. There was no smoke from the chimney. The front gate, usually tied shut with rope, swung open in the breeze. The barn door was ajar. No sound came from the property. No livestock, no birds, no sign of life at all. He dismounted and called out, "Ezekiel, Amos." His voice fell flat against the wind. He approached the front door, each step hesitant, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He rapped his knuckles once, then pushed the door inward. It gave with a groan. The scene inside would never leave him. The 4 brothers were seated at the table, each in their usual place. Ezekiel at the head, Jonah opposite, Amos and Silas on either side. The table was still set. Wooden bowls crusted with dried stew, chunks of bread hardened into stone. Their cups had cracked with frost, and inside the tea had frozen solid. Yet none of them looked as if they had been dead a day. Their posture was unnatural, too rigid, too symmetrical. Their hands rested flat on the table, palms down. Their eyes were wide open, glassy and locked forward, each face wearing an expression Henry later described as a silence screaming through their bones. No blood, no bruises, no wounds, just the stillness of something long past understanding. He staggered back, one hand over his mouth, and ran, not just away from the house, but all the way to town, where he burst into the sheriff's office, gasping for words. The sheriff, Albert Grady, a hard man with years of service under his belt, didn't laugh. He didn't mock Henry, or dismiss the tale as drunken nonsense. He'd seen enough strange things on the plains to know when something was wrong beneath the surface. They returned together that evening with 2 deputies and a local preacher. The brothers hadn't moved. The air inside the house was unnaturally cold, colder even than outside. The preacher, Reverend Bell, took one look at the brothers and refused to enter. "Something unholy has passed through here," he said, voice shaking. "This is no ordinary death." The sheriff examined the bodies with a clinical eye. He found no signs of violence, no signs of struggle or panic, just stillness. Their clothes were clean, even pressed in places. Their boots were free of mud, their fingernails trimmed. Only the faces betrayed something deeper. The expressions were not peaceful. They were frozen in something like terror, but deeper, older, as if they had seen something not meant for human eyes. When the doctor arrived 2 days later, his findings only deepened the mystery. The bodies had not decomposed, not even slightly. There was no smell, no bloating, no stiffness in the limbs. In fact, if not for the silence, one might think they'd merely paused mid-meal, listening for some distant sound only they could hear. That night, The town's blacksmith nailed boards over the windows. Salt was scattered in the doorways. The house was sealed, but not in mourning, in fear. Something had come to the Whitlock home in the dead of winter, and whatever it was, it hadn't left. The weeks that followed the discovery of the Whitlock brothers tested the very boundaries of what the people of Grey Hollow understood about death. Most had expected time to bring answers, or at the very least, some sign of natural decay. But neither came. Instead, time seemed to bend at the threshold of the Whitlock house. The air around it grew still. Birds stopped flying overhead. The wind didn't touch the shutters. No matter the hour or the weather, the house stood silent and perfectly undisturbed, as though nothing inside could ever change. Inside, the four brothers remained seated just as they had been, bodies untouched by rot or vermin, their skin smooth, not pallid or sunken, but unnervingly lifelike. Ezekiel's stubble had not grown. Silas still wore the same splinter on his thumb that Henry Cobb had seen weeks before. Jonah's lips, blue-tinged from the cold, had not cracked. What little dust that formed in the corners of the house never gathered on them, almost as if the air itself dared not touch them. The town physician, Dr. Amos Wilridge, returned several times under pressure from the sheriff, though he protested each visit more than the last. He brought a mercury thermometer, which failed to register any temperature in the bodies at all. He brought a candle, holding it under Silas's nostrils to test for breath. There was none. Still, he left each time shaken and unsatisfied, unable to explain what should have been obvious. They were dead, but not in a way anyone had ever seen. He once brought his apprentice, a boy named Lem, who had grown up with the Whitlocks. Lem had cried when he saw them, sobbing not out of fear, but confusion. "They're sitting like they're waiting," he said softly. "Like if we said the right thing, they'd just turn and answer." After that visit, Lem stopped speaking entirely. His mother claimed he slept with his back against the wall and never entered a room without checking every corner first. The doctor never brought anyone else. There were others, too, drawn by curiosity or dread. A pastor from Topeka arrived uninvited, declaring his intent to pray the evil out of the home. He entered alone and stayed less than an hour. When he emerged, he was pale and speechless, clutching a rosary so tightly it had embedded into the skin of his hand. He never made the return journey. Instead, he wandered into the fields that night and was found days later, face down in a shallow pond, eyes wide open and mouth full of soil. The sheriff sent word to a regional medical society in Wichita, hoping someone with more experience might make sense of the phenomenon. 2 men answered, one a young biologist with a passion for rare anomalies, the other a seasoned professor of pathology who had served in the war. They arrived skeptical, but after a single night in town, both became silent on the matter. The biologist reportedly vomited upon first entering the Whitlock home. The professor examined the bodies briefly before pacing in circles around the table, whispering measurements under his breath that didn't make sense. 11 hands across the arc, 4 forward, 1 fixed, and refused to discuss it afterward. Their official report, filed with the county office, was just 5 words. "Recommend complete sealing, no contact." The town followed that advice. But what unnerved the townsfolk most wasn't the scientific failure to explain the brothers' condition. It was the feeling that the failure itself had been expected, as though whatever had happened had intentionally left no evidence for science to grasp. The Whitlocks weren't simply dead. They were removed in some way from the cycle that governed all other living things. It was as if they had stepped outside the world's rules or had been pushed. The few who stayed close to the case noticed things. Clocks brought into the house would stop. Compass needles spun aimlessly. Mold grew backward on the bread, white first, then green, then clean again. One man, a former army medic who had seen mass graves at Shiloh, visited once and left muttering, "They're not bodies. They're waiting rooms." As summer turned to fall, the county quietly redacted all open documents regarding the Whitlocks. No cause of death was ever issued. The coroner moved away without notice. Even the preachers stopped offering prayers. The people of Gray Hollow did what people always do in the face of the inexplicable. They stopped asking questions. They stopped looking. And yet, through it all, the four brothers remained at their table, unmoving, unchanging, untouched by time. Not long after the house was sealed and the whispers began to spread beyond Gray Hollow, an old man named Bartholomew Judd arrived in town under the guise of a distant cousin to the Whitlocks. He bore no family resemblance, and no one had ever heard the brothers mention him, but the sheriff allowed him 1 hour in the house, if only to appease the lingering hope that someone, somewhere, might claim the dead. Bartholomew was in the house for only 20 minutes. When he emerged, he looked pale, but not shaken like the others. Instead, he appeared thoughtful, solemn even, as if he had seen something he recognized but didn't wish to name. He tipped his hat to the sheriff, handed him a worn envelope, and left town that night without staying the hour. Inside the envelope was a key and a note written in spidery handwriting that simply said, "Beneath the table. That which was buried should never have been touched." The sheriff hesitated to act on the message, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread won out. Under the light of a lantern, he returned to the Whitlock house alone. The brothers remained exactly as they had been, unmoving, gazes fixed on something that seemed just past the edge of human vision. The sheriff moved the table aside with great effort. It had grown strangely heavy, its legs stiff, as if it resisted the shift. Beneath one of the floorboards, nailed down tight, he found the lock the key was meant for. He pried it loose and lifted the board. Below lay a hidden compartment, no more than a foot deep. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and twine, was a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was stiff with age and water damage, though the pages within were remarkably intact. The inside front page bore a name in tight, deliberate script: Ezekiel Whitlock. At first, the journal read like any farmer's record: crop rotations, cattle health, equipment repairs. But around the middle of October, something shifted. Ezekiel's tone grew erratic. He mentioned digging a new well and how the soil had turned black as soot, damp with something that shimmered but was not water. Jonah had found a stone, smooth and impossibly cold, with no edges, no grain, just perfect symmetry and a faint vibration that could be felt in the bone. It was Jonah, always the curious one, who had insisted they keep it. He set it in a box lined with linen and stored it beneath his bed. But within days, all four brothers began experiencing the same dream: a circle of stone columns under a starless sky, with something vast and coiled moving just beyond sight. They began waking at the same time each night, 2:17 a.m., to find themselves already sitting at the table, hands flat, eyes open, unaware of how they'd gotten there. By early November, Ezekiel was no longer writing in full sentences. His entries became fragmented, peppered with symbols, glyphs that did not belong to any language known in Gray Hollow or anywhere else. Pages were filled with diagrams of circles within circles, marked with notations about alignment and reciprocal stillness. The word listener appeared again and again, sometimes in the margins, sometimes centered across entire pages. The most disturbing entries came in the final days. Ezekiel wrote of the house growing quiet, too quiet. No creaks, no wind, no birds. Time inside seemed to slow. He noted that shadows began moving independently of their sources. Their reflection in the mirror no longer matched their movements. One entry read, "We are no longer alone in this house. She has found her way in through the stone." The last page contained only a single line, scrawled in handwriting that looked rushed and uneven. "We will sit. We will wait. She will rise when the mouth opens." The sheriff locked the journal away in the church cellar and never spoke of it again. But from that day forward, strange things began to happen across town. Children spoke of dreams they couldn't explain, often repeating lines from the journal verbatim. One girl carved the symbol of a coiled spiral into the pews during a sermon. A farmer found a calf born with two heads, both blind, both humming faintly through the night. Reverend Bell said the ground had been open, not just in soil, but in spirit, that something ancient had been pulled up, something buried long before a man walked these plains. The well the brothers had dug was filled with stones and salt, then sealed with iron. No one dared drink from it. And though the house remained closed, the feeling grew that whatever had been waiting beneath that floorboard had only just begun to stir. When the official investigators arrived from the east, they did so with the usual arrogance that accompanied educated men of that era. There were three of them: Dr. Theodore Marsh, a professor of medical pathology from Boston; Reverend Abner Cole, a spiritualist from Philadelphia who had gained attention for allegedly surviving a seance gone wrong; and Henry Sipes, a junior archivist with the Smithsonian who tagged along more to observe than to participate. They arrived with trunks of instruments, notebooks, copper pendulums, candles, and a thick sense of confidence that whatever had silenced the town of Gray Hollow could be measured, catalogued, or cast out. The house, of course, welcomed them with silence. The bodies remained, still seated, still untouched by time or decay. Ezekiel's pupils hadn't clouded. Jonah's fingers still held the impression of a spoon no longer in sight. Dr. Marsh was the first to examine them closely. He muttered observations as he measured the stiffness of joints and the ambient temperature of their skin. But when he leaned in close to check the dilation of Silas's eyes, he paused and then recoiled slightly. He swore he saw the pupil contract, just a flicker, a twitch, like something living adjusting to the light. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. And that night, the men stayed in the house. They insisted it was necessary to gather overnight readings, particularly during the early morning hours, when most of the strange events seemed to occur. They brought in a clock, a compass, and 2 candles blessed by different faiths. At 2:17 a.m., the clock stopped. The compass needle spun briefly, then halted, pointing west-northwest, directly beneath the floor. By sunrise, the archivist Sipes was missing. They found him just after noon, curled up behind the barn, naked from the waist up, arms scrawled with shallow carvings of concentric circles and foreign symbols. His mouth was filled with dirt, and his eyes were swollen shut, as though he had seen too much. He refused to speak, only humming a soft, rhythmic tone that repeated exactly every 42 seconds. Dr. Marsh tried to bring him back inside the house, but Sipes screamed the moment they crossed the threshold. The scream had no pitch. It didn't echo. It fell out of his mouth and died instantly, like a sound dropped into a well too deep for return. That same afternoon, Reverend Cole took the mirror from the parlor, the same mirror the deputy had once used to search for breath, and positioned it in front of Ezekiel. What he saw was never described. He simply dropped the mirror, stepped back, and began reciting names no one had ever heard. He walked out of the house, blindfolded himself with his own necktie, and sat in the church garden until evening, refusing to speak with anyone. When asked what he had seen, he said only, "I saw her, and she saw me back." By the next day, the sheriff demanded the investigators leave. Dr. Marsh agreed without protest. Before boarding his train, he handed the sheriff a sealed envelope with a recommendation, written hastily and with no pretense of academic formality. It read, "Cease inquiry. Do not permit further study. Burn what can burn. Seal what cannot." The report was never filed with any university or federal archive. Sipes was taken back east by train, his humming continuing without pause for 5 days straight, until, according to rumor, he went silent just outside of Pittsburgh, and has never spoken since. Reverend Cole returned to Philadelphia and took a vow of silence, broken only once. During a lecture, he interrupted by standing, pointing at a circle drawn on the chalkboard, and saying, "That shape does not belong to us." What was meant to be a scientific study became a hasty retreat. What was intended to be a spiritual cleansing ended in quiet collapse. No photographs were taken, no samples preserved. Every person who came into the Whitlock home left changed, if they left at all, and so eventually they stopped coming. The property was listed as condemned, though no one had the stomach to tear the house down. Even the suggestion brought unease, as if disturbing it might unseal something that had only half closed. The records were shelved, misfiled under a different name, and the authorities issued a statement of no conclusive findings, which quietly disappeared from the state archive the following year. From that point on, the Whitlock house became one of those places spoken of only in passing, if at all. A place not haunted, not cursed, but rejected by every framework humans use to make sense of the world. Even after the investigators abandoned the case and the official records vanished into quiet, bureaucratic graves, the town of Gray Hollow was never the same. In the weeks that followed the last Eastern visitor's departure, a heavy stillness settled over the town. Not just the air, but the people. It wasn't a silence of grief, nor one born of reverence. It was the silence of something waiting. Children were the first to sense it. They began to draw strange symbols in the dirt during recess, spirals and sharp-edged triangles they claimed to have seen in dreams. Some would wake in the middle of the night with nosebleeds and blackened fingernails. Others were found sleepwalking toward the edge of town, always in the same direction, toward the Whitlock farm. When asked why, one girl simply said, "She hums louder out there." The adults didn't fare much better. Crops failed without reason, despite the soil testing rich and moist. Cattle born after the frost refused to eat unless led in circles first. 3 counterclockwise turns always, and then there were the voices. Not loud or clear, but just beneath the edge of hearing. Whispers in empty rooms, conversations bleeding through walls that weren't there. Some townsfolk claimed they could hear their own names being spoken from places they hadn't visited in days. At first, people blamed stress, the long winter, the haunting story of the Whitlocks, the uncertainty. But soon the events grew too specific, too coordinated. A storekeeper discovered all of his clocks had stopped at the exact same minute, 2:17 a.m., the time the brothers were said to have fallen silent. A woman named Lottie Bray swore her reflection had begun to lag just by a second or two, and only when the Whitlock property was mentioned in her presence. Others began to report shared dreams. Entire families woke recounting the same strange visions. Towers on fire beneath a black sun, footsteps crunching over ground that pulsed, and a low rhythmic chant echoing from a circular doorway carved into stone. It became unbearable. People began to leave. One by one, homes were abandoned. Shops were boarded up. The blacksmith packed his tools without a word and vanished with his family overnight. A teacher fled with only the clothes on her back after finding a page in her lesson book rewritten in some language she couldn't recognize but somehow understood. It said, "The mouth is open. The watchers wake." Within 5 years, Gray Hollow was a ghost of itself. The church bell hadn't rung in months. The schoolhouse roof had collapsed, untouched by weather. A census official arrived in 1883 and found only 11 residents remaining, none willing to speak of the Whitlocks, the journal, or the well. He noted that half of the buildings appeared to have been abandoned mid-task. Meals left uneaten, clothes still hanging on lines, tools rusting beside half-dug furrows. He asked why people left, and one old man, blind in one eye, simply whispered, "The lands remember." Shortly after that visit, the town was quietly removed from maps. The name Gray Hollow was struck from future county documents. No official decree, no formal erasure, just a slow, quiet vanishing. Letters stopped arriving. Supply wagons took new routes. Even trains no longer stopped at the nearby depot. The world turned away, as if repelled by something it didn't understand but feared waking further. Decades passed. The land, once buzzing with wheat fields and prairie sun, began to shift. Surveyors in the 1920s who passed through the area noted something strange in their reports. Small, circular depressions in the soil, always in patterns of 4, repeating across acres of untouched ground. In the center of these formations, nothing grew, not even weeds. Birds refused to land there. Instruments malfunctioned. And beneath the earth, deep penetrating rods struck something hard and metallic just under the surface, though no one ever dared dig further. Those who grew up hearing whispered tales of Gray Hollow often believed it was just that, a tale, a cautionary fable told by farmers and old men too drunk to forget. But satellite imaging in the early 2000s revealed something even modern science couldn't ignore. Beneath the earth, where the Whitlock house once stood, lay an unnatural geometric anomaly. Perfect concentric rings, unnaturally symmetrical, buried deep in the bedrock, something no known geological process could explain. And still, at the center of it all, the soil remains undisturbed, as though waiting for someone or something to finish what the brothers began. In the decades that followed the disappearance of Gray Hollow from maps and memory, the story of the Whitlock brothers survived only in fragments. A passing mention in a dusty journal, a footnote in a thesis rejected for speculative reasoning, a rumor told by an old rail worker who claimed he'd once stopped at a depot that no longer existed. But never more than that, never full, never whole. Every attempt to gather the truth seemed to fall apart, as if the story itself resisted being retold, as if the thing that had touched the Whitlocks didn't want to be known. And yet now and then, the mystery clawed its way back into the light. In 1976, a graduate student at the University of Chicago submitted a thesis titled Nonlinear Death States in Rural American Folklore. The thesis included a case study of an unnamed Kansas town where 4 bodies failed to decay and where a house acted as a temporal vacuum. It was based on the account of a now deceased coroner, handwritten letters from a Dr. Wilridge, and a photograph showing what appeared to be 4 seated men in a long abandoned house, faces blurred, eyes like pinholes. The university rejected the thesis outright, citing inconsistencies and unverifiable sources. The student, Margaret Klein, vanished shortly after, last seen boarding a bus bound west. Her apartment was cleared, and among her things was a single page torn from a notebook, bearing the same symbols from Ezekiel Whitlock's journal, spirals and sharp arcs drawn again and again in red ink. Beneath them she had written, "The waiting isn't over. It never was." Years later, in the early 2000s, a geologist named Dr. Wallace Greer ran a deep penetration radar survey of the region once known as Gray Hollow. The land had since reverted to wilderness. No structures remained. But beneath the surface, Greer's instruments detected something that shouldn't have been there, a perfect, concentric ring formation embedded in bedrock, far too symmetrical and massive to be natural. When he submitted his findings for a peer review, they were dismissed. His equipment was blamed. Funding was revoked. Within 6 months, Greer resigned and left no forwarding address. But he wasn't alone. Others had tried to bring the story into modern discourse. Folklorists, fringe scientists, even filmmakers. Every time, the result was the same: rejection, silence, or sudden disinterest. One documentarian recorded a 10-minute segment for a television special on American mysteries. The tape, according to studio logs, corrupted shortly after editing. When the footage was recovered, it showed only static overlaid with a low humming rhythm and 4 shapes seated at a table in total darkness. Even today, when articles surface online, buried in obscure blogs or corners of paranormal forums, they're often met with mockery or sudden deletion. Images vanish from threads, sources evaporate. Researchers pull out at the last minute, citing technical difficulties or simply claiming the subject no longer interests them. A few insist their dreams changed after reading about the Whitlocks, dreams of being watched from across an empty field, of voices whispering from beneath old wooden floors. The prevailing theory in fringe anthropology circles isn't that the story is too strange to be studied. It's that it does not allow itself to be studied, that whatever force claimed the Whitlocks in 1878 remains active in some form, guarding its silence. Some call it a sentient void. Others, an ancient intelligence awakened by accident. A few claim it's not a thing at all, but a condition, like an infection of reality, something that spread from the black stone beneath the house and rewrote the rules of life and death in a tiny, forgotten corner of Kansas. But the most haunting theory is the simplest one, that the Whitlocks didn't die, that they are still sitting at that table somewhere, not in our time, maybe not even in our dimension, but somewhere, still waiting, still listening, still holding their vigil in the moment just before something returns. Because some nights, in the fields outside the ruins of Gray Hollow, when the wind dies and the prairie holds its breath, a few who wander too close swear they hear it. That same rhythm, the hum, faint and low. 4 beats, then silence. 4 more, like a clock counting down, not to death, but to something far worse. And science has learned to look away.